Dear colleagues, I'm Marco Tibaldini. I'm an Italian scholar. I'm a historian. I'm a fellow researcher at the Department of Education of the University of Genoa, and I'm also a member of Clio 92, the Italian Association of History Teachers. Together with Euroclio and the Events Foundation, we are organizing the Pan-European Gathering of History Teachers to discuss how to introduce in history courses three current topics, which are environmental sustainability, migration, and inclusion. The topics that we decided to discuss and debate are very current, but in fact they have been part of human history for a very long time. To prepare for the upcoming gathering, we asked a few specialists to record some video lessons for us, and the first one was provided by Gary Rollefson. Gary is an archaeologist, specialized in the Neolithic. He directed the excavation on the site of Ein Ghazal in Jordan, which resulted as crucial for the understanding of life in the Neolithic, and some of the artifacts he found now are exhibited in the Louvre Museum. With his lecture, he will tell us the story of a community that dealt with climate change, migration, and inclusion in the Neolithic.
Thank you very much, Marco. So we've been working on the Neolithic since 1982, and over the past whatever number that is, 40 years, 45 years now, we've been able to throw back the curtain that covered up an extremely important period in the prehistoric, in the prehistory of Jordan and the Near East in general. There are some very strange developments that go on. Sometimes opportunities develop because of climate change. Sometimes opportunities are closed because of climate change. And in all aspects of social organization, these represent major interruptions of what might be considered to be both naturally organized and human organized changes. So we're going to be looking at Ein Ghazal in one case as a case study, and then we'll move to the desert of Jordan, the eastern desert, which is characterized by volcanic rocks, and it's referred to generally as the Black Desert. So to put into perspective where Ein Ghazal, where Jordan is for that matter, we're looking at now a slide of the world, and that red dot in the center is Jordan. The site of Ein Ghazal is located in the outskirts of the capital city of Amman. It's easy to drive to the site, excavate, and then drive back to the hotel. We'll be covering even more than 3,000 years of development at Ein Ghazal, and at the same time of Jordan and the Eastern Mediterranean in general. So Ein Ghazal begins at 8,300 BC, and it's occupied all the way, this is pre-pottery Neolithic, before the invention of ceramics. By 6,400 BC, ceramics are finally developed, and the Yarmouktian pottery Neolithic then lasts for about 1,600 years. Now, this map shows the excavation areas at Ein Ghazal. You can see that Ein Ghazal is located on both sides of the Zarqa River, and down near one corner of the site was the spring, which in Arabic is Ein, the spring of the gazelles, Ein Ghazal. To begin with, things were very small. here are some shots of this site from across the river. The main site goes all the way from the left side over to the right side. That's all Neolithic Ain Ghazal. It continues from the highway here all the way up to the top of the hill, practically, where the tree lines are. You pick that back up again. That's where we were looking earlier. It continues all the way down here, but a significant proportion of the site was destroyed in order to create this highway connecting the capital city of Amman with its major industrial center of Zarqa. Now we're on the other side of the river in the main site, and we're looking across at the opposite side of the Zarqa River. And the site continues all the way from this exposure of chalk, again, off to the right-hand side. Now, the pre-pottery Neolithic is often referred to as PPNB. And the middle part of the PPNB lasts for about 1,200 years. Originally, the site is very small. It's only about, I would guess 300 meters by 100 meters, terribly small compared to what's going to happen later. In this small village of Ain Ghazal, we have substantial constructions. Here, for example, we have a 2-room house, wall separating this room, doorway into another room that was removed during highway construction. This room here with the 2 large post holes is about 5 meters by 5 meters, very comfortable. You can just barely make out here a depression in the floor. The floors, by the way, are made of excellent quality lime plaster. This depression here is a hearth that probably served this room and that room before this wall was built. If you'll note, let me go back in just a second here. You'll notice that there's another building just to south side of the large one, and the wall has been removed because the building fell apart. So this is that other wall in between the 2 buildings. It was so narrow, people could not walk there. One wonders why you're building another wall if you can't use it. Here's a reconstruction of what the houses looked like during the earlier phase of Ain Ghazal in the middle PPNB. Isolated 1 and 2-room houses, each one housing probably a family of 6 or 7 people. I might point out that the infant mortality rate was very high and that longevity was rather low. Probably people lived only slightly more or slightly longer than all the way back to the Neanderthal period. Hunting was something that was very important, and so not surprisingly, we find an awful lot of arrowheads and spear points. They also were farming. This is after farming began, and these are sickle blades that were used for harvesting grain. Here you can see that asphalt was used to glue this sickle blade into a handle of either bone or of wood. Goats were already domesticated by 8,300 BC, and probably every family had between 5 to 10 goats during the year. I might point out that male goats, when they were born, were culled, so mostly the herds would be made of females. Cattle also occurred, although in this period, in the middle PPNB, they may have still been wild. But obviously it plays a major part in the sort of ritual area of the people of Ain Ghazal. All of these were surrounding a hearth, and the back parts of all of them heavily burned, suggesting that they were all facing outwards like the petals on a flower, and then discarded. After that burn session, they were simply thrown away into the trash. Human figurines were fairly frequent, and you'll notice that almost every case we have heads without bodies or bodies without heads. And as we'll see later, this mimics very much what happened to people when they died. They were, we'll get to that slide, but some of the people were buried beneath the floor of their house, but the skulls removed after the flesh disappeared. Fertility was something very important to these people. Again, high infant mortality meant that there was probably a fairly long period for women before they had a sizable family. The figurines here have impressions, rocker impressions, and emphasizes the abdomen where the child is located. Here's a woman sitting on her buttocks. Her feet go up along the knee and come back down over here, which I've been told is probably the easiest way to give birth. On the next slide, you can see somebody who's right just minutes before the birth event itself. This is a rather sad human figurine. We call it the Pietà. It's a person. We can't tell what the sex is, of course, but the person is lying on its back with its head raised, the left hand drawn across the face, and the right arm across a flat abdomen. So this looks like it might be commemorating the stillbirth of a child. Houses were well decorated using red ochre, hematite. This floor here, number 6 in one building, has finger painting using a red paint. To me, it looks like there is some kind of a bird feather indication here. Interestingly, this floor is just before the house was abandoned. There's an earlier floor with exactly the same kind of decoration about 10 centimeters below. So the house was abandoned for long enough that 10 centimeters of dirt accumulated, and they built another floor directly above it. I might also point out that this house is the only one that has this sort of bird feather motif. Sometimes the painting it doesn't have any symbolic meaning except for the fact that there is red paint on the floor. Now, if we go back to look at this house again, this is our main house called, well, who cares what it's called? But once we took that last plaster floor, there were several plaster floors that were built on top of each other, indicating that we had a lot of different episodes on how this house was occupied. But once the main floor was off, you can see all of these plaster patches down here. And each one of those patches is a covering of a burial. It was common for somebody in the family occupying that house that when that person died, they cut a hole through the floor, buried the skeleton, and covered it back up again. They waited for a certain amount of time, and I don't know how long that was, until the flesh would have decayed. And they would open up a new hole right over the skull, and the skull was removed, and you notice that the mandible, the lower jaw, was left behind because it's only held to the skull by organic material, and it was difficult for them to do anything with that mandible in any event. Several generations may have occupied the same house, or I should say the house may have been occupied over several generations. Here we have what we call a nest of skulls or caches of 4 people who were buried, whose skulls were buried at the same time. And the skulls all have indications that the face was recreated using lime plaster. These are often referred to as plastered skulls. And if you look carefully here, you can see that one of the eye orbits was filled with clay. We'll look at this one again later on. All 3 of these skulls, we have an elderly person here, probably in the 40s. We have a probably midlife 30s person here, and somebody who just kind of entered into his or her 20s. But even though we don't see plaster on the skulls now, if one looks in some of the smaller areas, like the ear holes or up in the nostrils, there is still some plaster left. Here we are back to that nest again, and you can see here that right on the edge of the eye is asphalt that was added as an eye liner, sort of what a lot of people still do to emphasize their eye. The center of the eye has a piece of asphalt applied to the eye to represent the iris. All 4 of these had that as well. Now, why were they buried at the same time? Probably because the plaster started to fall off. The plaster is good to hold the skulls together for a while, but eventually the bone is going to start to shatter. Sometimes it's not plaster that decorates the skulls, but instead paint. And you can see again, we have skulls with red paint. There is also some black coloring here, although it might be because this house caught on fire and this skull probably collapsed off the wall, or however they displayed the skull. We don't know for sure. This is our pièce de résistance. This is one of the most beautiful plastered skulls you can imagine. Just very, very delicate contours here. The eyes are treated very nicely. You can see the eyelid here. I mean, this is an artist, and this isn't just somebody who's coding a skull. One thing I'd like to point out, and that is that the noses, wherever we find them, do not really represent the populations of the Eastern Mediterranean at all. When we get to the statues, we'll see that again. The oldest plastered skulls we have date right to the beginning of the occupation at Ain Ghazal. These 3 plasters, these are the masks that used to be on the skulls. You can see the eyes are closed. In the slits between the upper and lower eyelids, again, is asphalt. Now, asphalt is available bubbling out of the Dead Sea. And so that's probably a 3 or 4 or 5 day walk to get the asphalt, and then 3 or 4 or 5 days back again. In any event, this style changes very quickly. Over the next 600 years, none of this kind of style will still be practiced. Some violence, rare indications of violence. On the other hand, we have to remember that we only get about 1 person every generation buried beneath the floor of the house. The others, we have no idea where they go. We don't even know if they're buried. They're on the edge of the Zarqa River, which during the occupation here was a lot it was much more like a river than today, much more water. So it may be that they were simply placed in the Zarka River, very much like the Ganges in India. But here you can see this is part of the skull here. And there is a flint blade here that enters into the skull. This entire circle here is part of the skull, or part of the interior of the skull, that was simply blasted away because of the force of whatever is going on. What does that mean? Is there a battle between Angazal and another Neolithic town? We don't know. It could simply be one husband's very angry at another guy who may have been doing things he shouldn't be doing. Now, of all of the burials we have, these are the most curious. Notice that the burials, even though the middle PPNB, when skulls are removed, these skulls remain attached to the rest of the skeleton. These are both kind of young, adolescent or very young females. And when they get buried, it's not beneath, pardon me, the floor of a house. They are literally crammed, stuffed into a trash pile. It certainly suggests they are not held in high esteem by the rest of the population. Might be they are immigrants from some problem in a nearby town, or it might be that they've been kicked out of the house by their parents. We don't know. And they've come to Angazal perhaps to act as a servant or some kind of doing field work. We don't know. As I mentioned before, infant mortality is very high. They are actually buried for the most part, but not in association with houses. Well, let me change that a little bit. The burial in the ground is not associated with houses. There are, I think, 3 or 4 burials that were buried on the floor of an abandoned building, separated from each other by about a meter each. There again, raising an awful lot of questions. Why is that pattern of burial in existence? Well, here we go. This is a cluster, a cache of plaster statues. This statue here, which is probably a male, is almost a meter high. It's made of plaster around an organic, probably cane or reed skeleton. And they are all buried very carefully, as if they were people, but they're not people. Many of them have decorations. Here we have the head. This is the first one we exposed, and literally the hair on the back of my neck stood on end. It has chalk eyes, very brilliant. It has an eyeliner of asphalt. It has an iris of asphalt that fell off. And then notice that we have 3 red stripes finger painted on the forehead, and then 3 stripes on each cheek, finger painted using red color. Amazing. Here are 3 of the group of 26 statues and busts that we excavated that year, 1983. The female statue here is very much like all of the rest of them, with the exception that she's drawing attention to her breasts. She also has a very broad pelvic region, again, perhaps associated in some degree with a meaning associated with fertility. Her eyes are the same as everybody else's eyes. This bust, which is only about 30 to 40 centimeters high, has a ridge of air that go a ridge of hair that goes from side to side, that is painted red. The eyes, again, with eyeliners and irises made of asphalt. And it might be that this person also has a red colored t-shirt. This male, we call it a male because it doesn't have breasts, but you can see it's got the same sort of hairdo, this crest that goes from side to side. It's got a little bit of painting on the cheek, although much of the painting is sort of rubbed off. Very strange arms, very short. Fingers are very odd. And this person has also got stripes painted on the thighs and on the calves. These we suspect may be tattoos. Again, it's hard to say for certain. If you look down above where the feet would have been, they broke off a long time ago. You can see a black patch which goes all the way around the back and comes up to the front again. You can see some binding material like a shoelace, perhaps. But anyway, those black anklets probably have something to do with, keeping your legs comfortable while you're walking around. This is another female, which unfortunately was cut in half by a later Neolithic pit digging. But she's drawing attention to her breasts, again, suggesting some kind of association with fertility, although there seems to be a little more sexually associated. She's wearing a skirt here, although this was covered with an awful lot of calcium carbonate, and we couldn't see if there was any pattern. Now, one of the strange things is that we might have some genetic abnormalities. If you look on the left hand of that female we saw earlier, she's got 6 fingers. This is a foot of one of the statues, and it's the left foot, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 toes on that left foot. Oh, Jesus, somebody's ringing the doorbell. We don't, if maybe this is just chance. Maybe we got people who don't know how to count. This woman, we consider it to be a female because of the pudenda, has a flat abdomen. She's wearing a stole of some kind, of fur or something, I don't know. But she has no real breasts unless these are taken to represent that. Her stole is, again, painted with red stripes, finger painted, as we see so often among the statues. Well, that was in 1983. In 1984, and one of the last days of the excavation, we saw this area here in the bulldozer section. And obviously, when they were making the road, they had cut through another cache of statues. We don't know how many, but we have at least 8 statues in here. And here again, genetic problems? I don't think so. I think this is all symbolic. But we had 3 double-headed busts, and these are very big. These are much larger than the busts from 1983. Again, just under a meter in height. But we also had 2 standing statues, with legs and feet. And they also were about the same size in terms of the height. You can see that there's a lot of similarity with the 1983 statues and with plastered skulls. Again, looking at how the eyes are treated. They have the same kind of hairstyle with a crest that goes from side to side. These didn't have any painting on them. They also are about 200 years later in time than the original. And yeah, they are very bizarre. In my own impression, as we'll see in terms of population dynamics and climate change or whatever, I think these represent, well, one head represents the population of Ain Ghazal, the other head represents the population of some other village that was abandoned for unknown reasons. And I'll come back to that because it's one of the biggest mysteries in the Neolithic period. But we have three of these two-headed statues. So it could be that it's not just the population of Ain Ghazal, but also a specific tribe, a specific clan, a specific family, extended family, we don't know. But it's going to be shortly after this, these appear, that in the Jordan Valley and in Palestine and on the eastern shore of the Mediterranean, all of the Neolithic villages were abandoned, period, not to be reoccupied for about 600 years. So we've got a major cataclysm represented by, in my opinion, represented by these statues. Here's, this fellow is on display in the Louvre, and we call him the man with his hands in his pockets. You can see there are no depicted arms or fingers. And it's pretty clear that this person, or the statue, wore a cape or some kind of a piece of textured weaving, so it was not necessary to display the arms. This person has got 5 toes on both feet, whether it's left or right, doesn't make any difference. There is an impression of woven textile on the back and of this person, of this statue, and on the back of the skull. So this is the situation between 8,500 to 7,500 BC. So they represent all of the middle PPNB sites over this 1,000-year period. But then, when we get to 7,500 BC, you notice there is nothing. There are no settlements whatsoever in the Jordan Valley, in Palestine, or on the eastern shoreline. All of those people moved up to the highlands of Jordan. And that was a major movement, a major migration of populations. If we look at Ain Ghazal, when it was first occupied, when it was first established, we suggest, we haven't excavated enough of the site to be sure, but we suggest that there were 60 families with 5 people in each family that lived beyond, let's say, 8 years of age. So we had a population at Ain Ghazal of 300 people. Now, at a population growth of 16 to 17%, which is fairly common for rural areas, per century, you see that it is slowly building up in terms of population size and population density. There's one area here, on the other hand, where you notice that the population is not is not 16 to 17%, it's 100%. And this represents the influx of populations leaving Jericho, for example, leaving any number of different abandoned villages. Now, this has an important aspect, several different very important aspects to the people who used to live in Ingazal and the new mixture of people with these new populations. First of all, there were trees. A lot of Jordan doesn't have trees. There were trees around Ingazal. And for the most part, the trees were used for fuel and for construction of roofs and a variety of other kinds of uses. And so they're cutting down trees every century, and we start to see that the area represented by those trees gets broader and broader and broader. The distance people have to go to reach forests to chop wood is farther and farther away. And again, by the time we get to the evacuation of the Jordan Valley and Palestine, we suddenly see this leap of 100% in terms of forest depletion. We can keep going forever on this. As I mentioned before, we have a population at small Ain Ghazal who have goats. And probably, again, we don't know exactly, but if it's 5 to 10 goats per family, they have to take their goats out of the village simply for grazing. And the distance they go from the center of Ain Ghazal gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And again, right at 7,500 BC, it suddenly jumps like mad. And these goats are repopulating, or they're growing in numbers a lot faster than people. And so they're going farther and farther away to the point where they're going to have to start taking all of their goats out at least 10 kilometers away. So that's a problem that none of these people had experienced before 7,500. Now, we're going to see this chart a couple of times more, but one of the things that you'll notice, this is the years. So here's 7,400 BC, 7,200, 7,600 BC. And this is the amount of rainfall and how it changes from year to year. Now, rainfall is increasing very nicely, thank you very much, until about 7,400 BC. And you notice there is a spike, or whatever the opposite of a spike is. So that rainfall was a severe problem during about 7,200 to 7,500 BC. Here are all these people coming up, demands for resources, grazing area, for trees, for fields, for their agriculture. All of that is getting tighter and tighter. This competition is starting to affect the people who are now living under this much larger population. That brings us at 7,500 BC to some major changes in not just the number of people, but how those people get along with each other, how those people get along with the spiritual world. Now, all of that burial stuff we saw, all of those statues and plastered skulls, that is certainly spiritual. And I can't see that it's anything other than a cult that venerates ancestry, that every house has its own particular branch of ancestry, which is different than the house next door, that the statues represent the ancestors of Ain Ghazal, not necessarily a specific clan or tribe, but all of Ain Ghazal. But that's going to change dramatically here after 7,500. Now, one thing I want to back up a little bit, and that's this. Yeah, in fact, I will back up. This is a drop in rainfall. But notice that, well, there's a confusion here. Why did everybody leave the Jordan Valley and the eastern seaboard? Because of climate. The same climate is enjoyed by Ain Ghazal, by the highlands of Jordan. If it was so severe that those people had to move away from their homelands, why were they able to survive up here from 7,500 to 7,000 without leaving to another completely different part of the Near East? That decrease is associated with climate change, but it doesn't answer all of the questions of why they did what they did. So this is the size of Ain Ghazal at the end of the middle PPNB. This is the size that Ain Ghazal becomes after 7,500 BC. Huge. A lot of people, a lot of bigger structures. Here, for example, we have a two-story house. So we've got the ground floor, and then we've got another floor above. At least 11 rooms on the ground floor, and probably 11 rooms up above. So we might have a house that has 3 or 4 different families, probably related families, sort of like grandfather and a bunch of sons and a bunch of daughters, whatever, living in the same place. There's an interesting alleyway here that comes around to enter the house. There are some steps down to the ground floor and a nice little hearth in the middle of the building. But here, instead of having single families, we're up to multiple families. Another element of architecture is the sudden emergence of cult buildings. Everybody, during middle PPNB Ain Ghazal, the only architecture were houses, were dwellings people lived in. But now we've got rooms, we've got buildings that have a specific purpose. Here, in this shrine, I'm calling it a shrine. Notice we have an apse at one end. It's relatively narrow, less than 2 meters wide. It has also a lime plaster floor. Here across the river, we have another apse. It's got this nice red painted border on it. In this shrine, we have 2 orthostats. And I'm calling it a shrine because with all of this new ancestry suddenly showing up, what about the ancestry of the people who were still there? You can't ask them to give it up simply because you've got new neighbors. So they are emphasizing their ancestry with these shrines so that this particular structure right here may have been used for ancestral purposes by related houses, related people, the houses of relatives, so that they would come here to observe whatever kind of ancestry celebration they did from time to time. I think we have 5 or 6 of those shrines now exposed during the late PPNB. And this is certainly one of the nicest ones. It was built in 4 different stages. So it changed in shape, it changed in size over time. Notice in the last iteration here, there's a big hole in the center of the thing. you can see perhaps just inside there are some stones sticking out, like this one. This stone is this one right here. And that stone is the capstone of a small tunnel that goes from the center of that hole out beyond this wall. It's like an air duct, bringing air into that hole, probably to feed a fire. Now, one thing that doesn't show up in this picture, but the edge of that hole reflects the floor going up. It's a cylinder. At one time, there was a cylinder. And so that cylinder probably had some kind of fireplace. This is the same shrine, but you can't see it in this picture. It looks like there's been subsidence of the floor. It probably is no longer stable. It may have been an earthquake. We don't know what caused it. It could simply be the slope is beginning to erode. But obviously, it happened at a time when it was urgent that they have another shrine built immediately. And this is very poorly constructed. It has a floor of only about 2 centimeters of plaster. Here you can see more like 6 or 7 centimeters of plaster. There is a hole, but it doesn't go anywhere. It's not a hole, it's kind of a depression. But there's no tunnel bringing in fresh air. Now, everyone probably has an assigned shrine, depending on who they're related to. But we've got a community here of people with some kind of spiritual problems. And these people of the late PPNB developed communal cult buildings. And I call them temples. A lot of people don't like me to call them temples, but they are oriented towards not individual groups of people, they're oriented to the entire community. So we have 2 temples. Here we have one, which is very small compared to, that's the upper temple, compared to the lower temple, which is very, very large, probably about 3 or 4 times the size of that one. In the upper temple, we have a rectangular sort of special cultic area. It has 3 standing stones, one of which fell over. Those standing stones come up to a hearth that's built on the floor. There's no hole. Between these stones that form the sides of that hearth is clay, not plaster, but clay, that's about 6 or 7 centimeters in thickness. And it was created, it turned into ceramics from the heat of that hearth. Now, between the 3 standing stones and the back wall is another hearth, which is surrounded by 7 stones. Remember that now, we've got 3 standing stones and 7 stones around the hearth. And that hearth has been painted red. There's no plaster on the floor. There's no plaster anyplace in this house except that one hearth between the standing stones and the back wall. This is the back wall. It's this element right here. There used to be a doorway. The doorway was blocked by a piece of limestone that bore very crude sculpture work on it. You can see a bump that represents perhaps a head, some low shoulders, and then the body. So that's the upper temple. The lower temple, as I say, is about 4 times the size of it. This back room is set off from another room that was on the other side of that wall. which was badly destroyed by erosion. This is on a very steep hill. There's a doorway here that leads to this inner room. And in that inner room, we have 3 standing stones. On top of the standing stones are 2 flat slabs that are, in my opinion, undoubtedly an altar. In front of that altar is again a piece of plaster, the only piece of plaster in that room, in the entire building. And that patch of plaster is surrounded again by 7 stones. Now, I don't know how much attention we should pay to these 2 instances that combine 3 and 7 elements as something that's going to continue throughout the rest of the rest of history in these areas. 3 is a magic number, 7 is a magic number. I don't know, maybe. Okay, so 7,000 BC. By now, we've got Ain Ghazal bursting at the seams in terms of population, in terms of demand on local resources, probably with an awful lot of discomfort due to the crowding of the. By now, it's not a village; it's a town, probably 3,000 to 4,000 people. But suddenly, we get this development, and it is sudden, and it lasts for about 200 years. It is a severe drought. And if this was a major setback, this is even worse. Ain Ghazal can no longer support populations of that size. And in fact, Ain Ghazal is all but abandoned. By 7,000 BC to 6,900 BC, 90% of the population, 90% of the architecture is abandoned. And we're only left with the sort of the shambles of Ain Ghazal. I think I've got some repetition here. Bear with me. Yes, we're just going to flip through this. Sorry. This is another late PPNB architectural development. It's a staircase that goes all the way from the edge of the site up towards, we lose it eventually, but that staircase directly faces the temple, the lower temple, the large temple. Okay, so this is what's left over after the exodus of 90% of the population. Pardon me. Busy now. So 90% decrease in population. The site collapses. The site is not 90% smaller. It's just that it's the distance between the buildings is so large now that it's not a densely occupied place. Now, Ain Ghazal, during the late PPNB, was a megasite. There are at least 11 megasites that is greater than 17 to 20 hectares in size. When all of those, can we stop this for a moment? Jesus. Sorry. In any event, we've got perhaps 50,000 people living in those megasites. So where did they all go? Many of them went back to the Jordan Valley. We start to see the recreation of at least small villages, if not large villages. But also, some of them went to new horizons, and those horizons lay towards the east. Here, from central Syria all the way down into northern Saudi Arabia, is a large volcanic field, a lot of volcanoes there, but there's also in this area right here. At one time, it was almost literally a sea of lava. It created a single covering of up to 15 to 30 meters of overlying basalt. This area out here, before the late PPNB, was occupied only by hunters. There were no shepherds out there at this time. The population was very small, probably less, well, not probably less than 2,000 people. Visitors flying over this basalt field, British airmail pilots back in the 1920s, were a little unhappy with what they saw. It's a desolate place. It is characterized by odious flat-topped slag heaps, a sinister foreboding if you're sitting there all by yourself, and it looks like a dead fire. Well, at this time, the 1920s, that's true. But we began working out in the basalt field. One excavation project was at a small wadi, a small stream called Wasad Pools, and the other in the mesas on the western edge of the Black Desert. One of the things to remember is that this was a period in general of increased precipitation. This area here at Ain Ghazal, anyway, suffered from overcrowding. You can't say that anybody was suffering from overcrowding out in the desert. The rainfall, 60% higher than at present. In some places, it may have been enough to establish agricultural fields again. But if so, probably not for a very long period of time. But at this time, after 6,900 BC, there was a lot more vegetation out in that desert. In fact, you probably couldn't really call it a desert anymore. We'll see some evidence of that. There were a lot more animals. There was a lot more vegetation for your own animals, your herds of sheep and goats, even your own herds of cattle. So this is Wasad Pools. This is the site of Wasad Pools. It has at least 300 to 400 buildings, although they're not all Neolithic, I should say. Here you can see just a few of the buildings that we mapped. But it was kind of a tight community out there as well. The attraction was this little stream here that had 9 pools where rainfall collected. Rain was almost always between October to May. Just this last May, I was out in this area, and from the rain of this year, all of these pools were completely filled. And at the end of the summer, there was still water in all of these pools. So these were not only for people to drink, but for animals to drink as well. One of the houses we excavated, relatively small, about 4 meters in diameter. It included this little niche or this alcove, sort of on both sides of which we had standing stones. Standing stones, you can automatically say it's a ritual expression. There's a standing stone in the center of the house. It had a plaster floor. The entire well, we call it a house. I'm not sure it is a house. It might be something more special. We had evidence of 4 separate replasterings of the alcove. There was that plastered basin in the floor. So it certainly is something that's very different than anything we had seen before. And here it's at the end of the PPNC. You can see it this date. This central standing stone, about a meter high, 1.02. A lot of people suggest that this may have been to support a roof. No, you would be crawling on your hands and knees all the time. This was roofed probably with reeds that were erected to create a dome above the house. So we were looking there at W66. Nearby is W80, somewhat much larger. Oh, this long feature here is an Iron Age feature. It's a monolithic, almost like a temple. And then we have a series of 44 burial chambers. But we'll look now at W80. From only 23 kilograms of bones that were recovered, more than 50% were gazelle. Gazelle are not easy to hunt, although they have some behavior that you can anticipate where to go hunting. Also, they had domesticated sheep and goats, about 20% of all the bones. There are also a lot of small mammals like hare and foxes and stuff. But certainly the focus was on gazelle and on sheep and goats. Sheep and goats, not so much for meat, but instead for dairy products. This is W80 and a fairly advanced excavation. Again, a central pillar in the middle of this, another apse here, a small doorway that is directly opposite a window in that apse. And on June 21st, the light strikes that window. It's a calendar for the change in seasons. There is a doorway back here that leads from the main room into a porch-like structure. And then there's a large forecourt on the outside. We have here a PPNC date and a couple of later dates that are still they were still hunting an awful lot, even though they didn't really have to because of all the protein they were getting from sheep and goat milk. Using very small, these are micro points. They're about the size of your thumbnail at the largest, but there are also some very teeny ones. Butchering knives. So that's the site of Wasad Pool. So that's on the eastern edge of the Black Desert. If we go 30 kilometers to the west, we come to the Wadi al-Qatafi. This is the wadi here. And on each side of the Wadi al-Qatafi are these mesas left after the original 15 to 30 meters of basalt. And around at the feet of all of these mesas, we have counted roughly 800 structures, most of which are probably houses. We excavated one of those structures here at the foot of mesa number 7. And like W80, 30 kilometers away, we had another circular house with a central standing stone. Here, maybe something to do with ritual as well. There's a doorway here. You see this sunlight on the the bottom step of a staircase that leads in here. This is about 5 meters in diameter. But guess what strikes the central standing stone on June 21st? Another calendric date. A couple of sites after the PPNC dates, a couple of dates that are after the PPNC, but this was still a very active structure used by people for probably about 400 years. But they didn't live in there all 400 years, and it was occasionally abandoned. That bad reputation that the basalt fields received by those airmail pilots makes you wonder, why would anybody want to go out there and live? Because I don't even know why that nose there. At the base of that first house we looked at, the house was built on top of a sandy, granular silt, which held rainwater. So when it rained, it didn't just run off into the wadi. It was absorbed and provided humidity, provided water for plants long, long after the rain ended. We looked in a bulldozer cut out in this dry lake bed out here. We found the same soil, the same color, same consistency, same granularity. And it's not too far from W66. And we looked at those sediment cores, at the pollen that was still there, and look at what is out there. Oak trees, pine trees, juniper trees. I have no idea what Austria is. Elm trees and willow trees. Now, of those, willow trees are probably the most indicative of what the situation was like out there. Was it sinister? Was it foreboding? Well, no. Salix releases pollen only onto water. And in order for that pollen to make it to other trees, it doesn't go in the air. It has to be on full standing water. So the kind of landscape that we see out there today was certainly something completely different back then. And again, quercus or oaks don't spray pollen into the air that travels for more than maybe a kilometer or 2 kilometers. Also, another pollen plant is lemna. And I don't know how many of you go off to sort of back pools of water. Very often, here in Germany anyway, it's covered with these little leaves called duckweed. There again, we have full standing, permanent, well, maybe permanent water. Another one is Typholatifolia, these sort of bulrushes, which provides a very valuable resource for these people. Not only does it indicate that it's very moist out there, but you can use typha for weaving mats, weaving baskets, weaving roof mats over your house. we didn't have pollen that we could distinguish. These are Phragmites reeds. You can't tell that there were Phragmites reeds out there, but in all of the standing water in oases in the Eastern Desert, these grow. You have to control them. They take up all the water. So these would have been used for roofing as well. Now with those oak trees, they are prodigious producers of acorns, and acorns are a very valuable resource. If you grind them up, see all of these little depressions in the grinding stones, those are indicative of acorn processing, pounding them until they're a mush, and then you can fry them, you can cook them. I don't know, maybe they add something else for taste. Axes. Why would you have an axe in the desert unless there were trees? But the mainstay, perhaps, in terms of meat anyway, were those gazelle still. Now, the technique of hunting gazelle back in, let's say, 7,500 BC or 7,300 BC was stalking a herd. 2 hunters, 3 hunters, keeping out of sight, keeping upwind of the gazelle. But you're never going to get more than 2 or 3 gazelle at a time. But a technological innovation developed in something called kites. And these are structures that direct herds of gazelle into enormous traps. Here, for example, you can see a wall, another wall, another wall, and another wall, all leading to this trap, which is about 200 meters in diameter. Once the gazelle get in here, there's not much they can do. And so you just have, the hunters would have trouble shooting fast enough, because in some cases, even very small kites, you might get 150 gazelle at once, at one time. So you can see this stuff is all over the place. These kites go all the way from inside Syria, inside northern Syria, all the way down into Saudi Arabia. Now, one of the things about those kites, you're building the walls using basalt, using these big pieces of basalt. And these are pictures taken in the 1920s when the road was constructed through the basalt desert. And moving all of these stones into roads, or in the case of kites, into the walls leading to the trap and building the trap wall itself, was heavy, heavy labor. It's been suggested that just a medium-sized kite could be built by 10 people over a 3-month, 1 to 2 months to build. Some of those we saw before here, these probably took 3 to 4 months or 5 months to build. But then you also have to remember that you have to maintain these traps. You have to go back and make sure that those walls haven't collapsed or tumbled. Some of these arms that lead the gazelle into those traps are up to 10 kilometers, even more, longer in length. It's worthwhile expending all of that labor for the returns you get on that labor. But another thing is, you've got all of these new people coming out now, taking advantage of a much nicer environment that we see today. And so there was a demand for labor, but there was also the labor pool. Another aspect too is that domestic dogs certainly made it much easier to stampede the animals up towards those arms that converge the herds into the traps. Here you can see, if you look down here, you can see we've got different colors representing different overlapping kites. So their arms cross the arms of other kites in that chain. And it's almost like you're building up a prison for these gazelle once you start going on to force them into the traps. One of the things that we see, this climate change is going on all the time. I mean, we see increase in rainfall, decrease in rainfall, increase in rainfall. I mean, these are just natural occurrences out in the desert. There was one severe decrease in rainfall where the desert may have been more or less abandoned. But it regained, and then there was an inevitable decrease in rainfall until about 5,000 BC, maybe 4,500 BC. Modern conditions came into being. And then the people went back to very poor chances of hunting gazelle. And in fact, it would remain virtually empty in the Black Desert until a new resource became available. In the Iron Age, beginning around 1100 BC, camels. Camels were domesticated in Saudi Arabia, in Oman, and eventually brought into the desert. And once that happened, we see a rise in the population of the Bedouin, but only because of the domestication of the camel. So we've gone through 3,000 years. It's about an hour and a half, I guess. If there's anything I can explain better or explain for the first time, I'd be happy to do so.
Thank you very much, Gary, for your presentation. So, summarizing is the story of how the climate change impacted on the life of Neolithic communities, forcing them to migrate and forcing them to adopt new technological or social or how can we say cultural innovations, and also how this climate change is always running. So also the people that settle in Ein Ghazal has been forced to move to the Black Desert and to readapt to new conditions and new ways of life, bringing a little bit of their traditions, but they've been forced to adapt to new situations. Of course, it's always interesting for me when I listen to your talks, and I've been, for the very first time, I realized that the two ritual buildings that you mentioned in the Black Desert, they are far from each other, and they can be indicative of the fact that the people that lived in those two far areas shared the same, how can we say, religious or a ritual attitude. And also, a final remark is, after that they built a series of kites, this is a series of traps for gazelle. Of course, the gazelle were, it was impossible for the gazelle to pass to the other side. And then you have to build another line of traps and another one further and another one further. And in this way, you push the gazelles toward the desert, and finally, this is a sort of a unsustainable exploitation of the natural resources. And thank you very much, because your lecture is very suitable. It's very well placed in our conference and provide us a lot of data, a lot of information about and also practical examples that we can use to deal with those topics include those topics in the teaching of the Neolithic, showing that the climate change, but also migration and processes of inclusion were already present at that time. And finally, a final remark, which is available, which is useful also for the other colleagues, is that if you want, you can look at all those sites on Google Maps with your students. It's very easy to find them. If you give a very quick look to the Black Desert of Jordan, you can surely find some line of stones. And if you follow that line of stones going toward west, you finally can find one of those traps mentioned by Gary Rollefson. So it's very easy and very intriguing and catchy also for the students to identify those structures. Do some of you have some questions? No, not at the moment. Okay, Gary, thank you again. I'm always very pleased and honored and delighted when I listen to your presentation. So I will try to visit you during the next year, so to have enough time to discuss with you, chit chat with you, and know what you, which are your projects for the future and for your activities in Saudi Arabia. And for all the others, we will publish the recording of the video on the website of Clio 92, so that will be available for everybody also after the conference. And we will meet in Bergamo. But I see that Ute, she has a question. Please, Ute.
A bit belated, I'm sorry. I happened to be in Abu Dhabi just 2 weeks ago, and I was so lucky to go to the Louvre Museum there. It had a number of exhibitions also of pieces from local excavations. And the guide there told us that they're working on a lot of, there are a lot of excavations on the way now in Abu Dhabi. And from what he explained to me, Abu Dhabi means also father of the gazelle. So I found it very interesting because that place, of course, as I was explained, is also a place where people observed where the gazelles are drinking to find water sources. And I was wondering, do you know anything about the settlements there? Is there anything that you can relate to what you explained just now, or is it a totally different area with totally different people and cultures?
Well, it is pretty far away from Western Jordan anyway. Western Jordan is mostly facing towards the Mediterranean. Whereas from the Black Desert, you're facing towards the eastern part of, the northern and eastern part, and all the way to the Gulf itself. Personally, I haven't been to Abu Dhabi or Oman. Yeah, no, I haven't. And I haven't read very much about their archaeology. Most of the archaeology is much later than what we have. It's not really Neolithic yet. But there are more and more often new excavation projects that are going on. I don't know so much about Abu Dhabi, but Oman, for example, has got a lot of projects in the field. Saudi Arabia, we're trying to get to Saudi Arabia next year. Although, again, it's not really Neolithic, it's just post-Neolithic. Yeah, well, it's called Rajajit. You ought to Google that. It's really a neat place. there's a lot of Neolithic work going on now in Saudi Arabia, up in the food desert. And if you look, Google David Kennedy. He flies helicopters all over the place and takes pictures of constructions on the ground in Jordan, but especially now in Saudi Arabia. It is magnificent. The architecture out there is just, it's mind-blowing in the sense, where are all the people now? Because it looks like, they've got gangs of 100 people each building literally thousands of kites or other structures similar in terms of labor requirements. So 10 years ago, there were very few excavation sites that were prehistoric. There's always people, digging up kingdoms and stuff like that. But now it's really gone very strongly towards prehistoric and especially in the Neolithic period.
Gary, one question. Since I remember that you mentioned in a previous lecture that I've heard of you, what happened when people of different clans met in Ain-Ghazal?
Well, I think the first thing, if there's a strange group that you don't recognize and they come into Ain-Ghazal, the first thing to do is to develop a study of the relationship of that strange group with your group. And it may require creating a fictitious kinship relationship. On the other hand, it might be that the people coming up from Jericho know people from Ain-Ghazal. They may have already exchanged husbands and wives or whatever, because Jericho is not that far away. If there were people coming up from Ashkelon in the southern coastline, probably there would be negotiations that you would try to find, again, fictitious relationships between Ashkelon and Tel Aviv, between Tel Aviv and Jericho, Jericho and Ain-Ghazal. In a way, it's going to be a kinship United Nations. But we have no indication whatsoever of violent interaction with it. The exception of that one person at Ain-Ghazal who got a knife in his head or something. We don't have any indications of sudden conflagrations where a lot of people die at the same time. We don't have houses that are destroyed and never rebuilt, for example. So I think mostly it was pretty peaceful. There was a lot of exchange of stuff, gifts. In Jordan, they were making beads by thousands. And there were fossils that were being collected and exchanged with people who lived in the Jordan Valley, or maybe people in Syria. So I think most of it was, first of all, not very, the meetings weren't of hundreds of people at a time, but probably, a few shepherds meeting a bunch of people going from one place to another, and they would exchange information, but nothing terribly worrisome, I would think.
So, in that situation, in that occasion, cultural inclusion or social inclusion, it worked well. In that occasion, cultural inclusion, it worked well.
I think so. Yeah. No. I mean, this movement, I said that there were around 11 megasites. Of those megasites, more than half were created originally. I mean, it's not a megasite. It's not a site that grows to a megasite. it's created as a megasite. And those are all in the south and Petra. The northern part of Jordan, if we have 5 or 6 megasites, it is this cultural inclusion coming from the west. And it seems to have worked out. I mean, there were problems, of course, but these could be resolved, by those, by temples and shrines, perhaps. Has worked at least for several hundred years.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Gary.